The sun was barely up when Miguel arrived at Premium Auto Works. The early morning light filtered through the high windows of the garage, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. He pulled his cleaning cart from the supply closet and began his daily routine, just as he had done every weekday for the past 7 years. Miguel was 58 years old with a head of salt and pepper hair and hands that told stories of hard work. Deep lines etched his face, especially around his eyes when he smiled, which wasn't often these days. He wore the same blue uniform every day, with Premium Auto Works stitched on one pocket and maintenance staff on the other, never his name. The mechanics would start arriving soon. First would be old Joe, who always got in early to organize his tools before the rush began. Then the younger guys would come in laughing and talking about their evenings, barely noticing Miguel as he quietly worked around them. "Morning," Joe nodded as he entered, hanging his worn leather jacket on the hook by his station. "Good morning," Miguel replied with a slight accent, continuing to sweep around the lifts. He always made sure Joe's area was spotless first, a small courtesy the older mechanic seemed to appreciate. By 8 a.m., the garage was alive with noise, impact wrenches whirring, the clang of metal tools, radio blasting classic rock songs, and mechanics shouting over the din. Cars lined up outside waiting for service. It was a busy shop, one of the most respected in town, handling everything from family sedans to high-end luxury vehicles. The owner, Ray, came through carrying his usual large coffee. "Looking good, Miguel," he said, the same thing he said every morning without really looking around. Miguel nodded politely. At least Ray acknowledged him, which was more than most did. To everyone at Premium Auto Works, Miguel was just the janitor, the quiet guy who kept the floors clean, took out the trash, and made sure the customer waiting area always had fresh coffee. They were friendly enough, but in the way people are when they don't really see you as part of their world. He was background noise, practically invisible. None of them knew that 20 years ago, in his home country, people used to line up specifically asking for Miguel to work on their cars. Back then, he owned a shop that employed 5 other mechanics. They called him the Wizard because he could diagnose problems just by listening to an engine. He'd fixed cars for government officials, local celebrities, and once even for a visiting diplomat. Miguel paused his sweeping and watched as one of the younger mechanics, a kid named Tony who couldn't be more than 25, struggled with a timing belt installation. The boy was doing it wrong. Miguel could tell from across the room. He was using too much force trying to muscle the belt into place instead of understanding how the tensioner worked. Miguel gripped his broom tighter, fighting the urge to walk over and show him. It wouldn't be welcome. He'd tried once, about 6 months after starting here, offering advice to a mechanic who was chasing an electrical gremlin. The guy had laughed in his face. "Stick to what you know, old man," he'd said, not unkindly but with the confidence of someone who couldn't imagine the janitor knowing anything about cars. After that, Miguel kept his knowledge to himself. It was safer that way, less painful. He continued sweeping, moving between the busy work bays. His eyes caught familiar problems. A loose connection here, a misaligned part there. His hands itched with muscle memory, wanting to reach for wrenches and screwdrivers instead of mops and trash bags. But life had dealt him this hand. When civil unrest forced him to leave his country, he'd arrived in America with nothing but a suitcase and hope. His credentials meant nothing here. His experience wasn't recognized. The language barrier was too high. Taking tests to get certified in his new country seemed impossible with his limited English. So he took what he could get, this job, cleaning up after mechanics who knew a fraction of what he did. It wasn't all bad. The pay was steady. The work wasn't too hard on his aging body. He had a small apartment not far from the shop, and he'd made it comfortable. On weekends, he sometimes helped neighbors with their car troubles for a little extra money or home-cooked meals. It gave him a chance to keep his skills sharp, and he still loved cars. That had never changed. He loved the smell of them, the sound of a perfectly tuned engine, the satisfaction of solving a problem others couldn't figure out. Sometimes when the shop was empty during lunch break, he would walk among the vehicles being worked on, just looking, sometimes gently touching a valve cover or air intake, the way someone might pet a sleeping animal. Today, a car caught his a beautiful late-model European sports car in deep blue. It was sitting in the problem bay, where the difficult cases went. He recognized it from yesterday and the day before. From the conversations he'd overheard, none of the mechanics could figure out what was wrong with it. Miguel finished his morning, cleaning, and headed to the break room to eat his lunch, a simple sandwich and an apple. He sat alone as usual, looking through an old car magazine someone had left behind. Through the break room window, he could see the mechanics clustered around the blue sports car, their body language showing frustration. He smiled slightly to himself. He'd heard the symptoms they described. He knew exactly what was wrong with that car. The problem wasn't even that difficult if you knew what to look for. But they hadn't asked him. They never would. So Miguel finished his lunch, put the magazine back exactly where he found it, and went to refill his cleaning cart. There were bathroom floors to mop and trash cans to empty. The blue car and its simple problem would have to wait for someone else to figure it out, or so he thought, until everything changed that afternoon. The blue sports car had arrived at Premium Auto Works exactly 2 weeks ago. Miguel remembered because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were when he deep cleaned the customer waiting area. He'd been wiping down the coffee machine when the car pulled up outside, its engine making a sound that immediately caught his attention. The noise wasn't right, a slight hesitation, almost a stutter, that came at irregular intervals. To the untrained ear, it might sound like nothing, but to Miguel, it spoke volumes. The owner was a tall man in an expensive suit who handed the keys to Ray with obvious concern on his face. "It keeps stalling," the man said. "Usually when I'm in traffic. Twice it nearly got me rear-ended." Miguel pretended to be busy with the coffee filters while listening. The man wasn't just any customer. He was Thomas Winters, CEO of Winters Property Development. His company owned half the commercial real estate in town, including the building that housed Premium Auto Works. He also headed the local business association that had sent most of the shop's high-end clients their way. "Don't worry, Mr. Winters," Ray assured him with the confidence of a man who had built his business on solving problems others couldn't. "We'll have it diagnosed by tomorrow. You can take the loaner car, and we'll call you as soon as we know what's going on." That had been 2 weeks ago. The car was still sitting in Bay 3, its gleaming blue paint now dulled by workshop dust, surrounded by increasingly desperate mechanics. The first week had started optimistically enough. Jason, the lead mechanic, had taken charge of the project. At 32, Jason was the youngest senior tech in the shop, but also the most talented. Or at least that's what everyone said. He had certificates covering one whole wall of his bay and wasn't shy about mentioning the sports car racing team he worked with on weekends. "Piece of cake," he'd told the others after Mr. Winters left. "Probably just a sensor." But it wasn't just a sensor. Miguel knew that from the sound, but no one asked him. The first 3 days, Jason ran every diagnostic test in the book. He hooked the car up to computers, tested the fuel pressure, checked the ignition system, and examined the electronics. Nothing showed up as faulty. On day 4, the car wouldn't even start for an hour, then suddenly roared to life as if nothing was wrong. By day 5, Jason had taken apart half the fuel delivery system, convinced the problem was there. "It has to be a fuel delivery issue," he insisted to Ray. "The way it's stalling, it's like it's being starved of fuel, but only for a split second." Ray nodded, though Miguel could see the worry lines deepening on his forehead. "Whatever it takes." "Jason." Mr. Winters called again this morning, not happy. The second week brought in reinforcements. Pete, the oldest mechanic at Premium Auto Works with nearly 40 years of experience, was pulled from his regular jobs to help. Even Joe, who normally only worked on American cars, joined the effort. The car sat in the middle of the shop like a patient surrounded by doctors, its engine exposed, parts laid out carefully on shop towels. They changed the fuel pump, the fuel filter, all the injectors. Still, the problem persisted. Miguel watched it all while going about his cleaning duties. Sometimes he'd linger near Bay 3, listening to their theories, mentally shaking his head. They were looking in the wrong place. He could tell by the particular way the engine hesitated, it wasn't a fuel issue at all. By yesterday, day 13, the tension in the shop was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Winters had called again, this time telling Ray that his patience was running out. If they couldn't fix his car, maybe he needed to rethink his arrangement with Premium Auto Works, and maybe mention his experience to his friends and associates. Now on day 14, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Miguel arrived to find Ray, Jason, Pete, and Joe already gathered around the blue car, none of them speaking much. The usual morning banter was absent. The radio stayed off. "Try it again," Jason said, his voice tight. Pete turned the key. The engine started smoothly, ran for about 20 seconds, then coughed and died. "Damn it." Jason slammed his hand on the fender, then immediately checked to make sure he hadn't dented it. "That doesn't make any sense. We replaced everything in the fuel system." "Could be electrical," Joe suggested, not for the first time. "We checked all the connections, all the grounds. Twice." Jason ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of grease. "The computer isn't showing any codes, the fuel pressure is perfect, the spark is strong." Ray looked at his watch. "Mr. Winters will be calling again today, I know it, and I'm running out of excuses." Miguel swept nearby, keeping his head down, but his ears open. He knew what they were missing. The problem wasn't with the fuel system or the electrical system, not directly. It was something much simpler, yet easy to overlook if you didn't know what to listen for. Through the morning, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Other customers came and went, their cars fixed and returned while the blue sports car sat mocking everyone. By lunch, Jason was skipping food, obsessively rechecking everything they'd already checked. Miguel ate his sandwich quickly and returned to find Jason lying on his back under the car, flashlight in hand, muttering to himself. "What about vapor? Lock?" Pete suggested, crouching beside Jason. "In a modern fuel-injected car? Come on." Jason slid out from under the vehicle, his face smeared with dirt and frustration. "This isn't some 1970s carburetor setup. I'm just saying, the symptoms could be 50 different things." Jason stood up too quickly and knocked over a tool tray. Tools clattered across the concrete floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet garage. Miguel moved forward automatically with his broom and dustpan to help clean up the mess. As he knelt to pick up a dropped wrench, his eyes caught something in the engine bay that made him pause. From his angle, he could see what the others had missed. A slight modification to the fuel pressure regulator that didn't look factory standard. It had been installed at a subtly wrong angle, just enough that under certain conditions. "Let me clean that up," Miguel said quietly, reaching for the scattered tools. Jason ran both hands down his face, leaving more smudges. "Sorry about the mess." He seemed genuinely apologetic, the first time Miguel could remember Jason ever really noticing him. "No problem," Miguel replied, gathering the tools. He hesitated, then added, "The car, I think maybe," but his words were cut off by Ray's voice from the office. "Jason, Mr. Winters on line 1, he wants an update." Jason's shoulders slumped as he headed toward the office, looking like a man walking to his own execution. Miguel finished cleaning up the tools, stealing one more glance at the engine bay. He was sure now. The problem was right there, visible if you knew what to look for. But as he straightened up and pushed his cleaning cart forward, he reminded himself, nobody here cared what the janitor thought. The lunch hour at Premium Auto Works was normally a relaxed affair. Mechanics would gather in the break room, unwrapping sandwiches from home or takeout from the deli down the street. They'd talk about their weekend plans, sports, or whatever crazy car problem they'd solved that morning. But today was different. The blue sports car had cast a shadow over everything. Jason returned from his phone call with Mr. Winters looking like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His face was pale except for 2 spots of color high on his cheekbones, a sign of stress that Miguel recognized all too well from his own days running a shop. "We have until tomorrow," Jason announced to Pete and Joe, who were waiting by the troublesome car. "That's it. Mr. Winters said if we can't fix it by closing time tomorrow, he's having it towed to the dealership in the city, Ray emerged from his office, his usual confident stride replaced by a worried shuffle. "It's not just the car," he said quietly. "If we lose Winters, we lose his referrals. That's nearly 30% of our high-end business." The group fell silent, the weight of what this meant hanging in the air. Miguel continued mopping nearby, making himself as inconspicuous as possible while staying within earshot. "I've tried everything," Jason said, running a hand through his hair for what must have been the 100th time that day. "Every single thing I can think of." "There's something we're missing," Pete insisted. "Has to be." Joe nodded. "What about taking her for a longer test drive? Maybe if we get her properly warmed up, the problem will show itself more clearly." "We've driven it around the block a dozen times," Jason countered. "The problem happens randomly, sometimes right away, sometimes after 20 minutes. Miguel finished his mopping and moved to empty the trash cans. He could leave, go clean the restrooms or the waiting area, but something kept him nearby. The solution was so clear to him now that he'd seen the modified fuel pressure regulator. It was an aftermarket part, probably installed by some mechanic who didn't quite understand the fuel delivery system on European sports cars. Ray checked his watch. "All right, lunch break. Let's all take 30 minutes, clear our heads, then come back fresh. Maybe we'll see something we missed." The men trudged toward the break room. Miguel waited until they were gone, then approached the blue car. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then leaned over the engine bay. Yes, there it was. Exactly what he thought. The modified regulator was installed at a slight angle, creating the potential for a vapor lock under specific conditions. It wouldn't show up on diagnostics because it wasn't an electrical problem or a permanent mechanical failure. "Hey, what are you doing?" Miguel straightened up quickly. Jason had returned, sandwich in hand, suspicion on his face. "I just cleaning around car," Miguel said, gesturing with his trash bag. Jason continued to stare at him. "Were you looking at the engine?" Miguel hesitated. 20 years of being dismissed, of being invisible, made him want to just shake his head and walk away. But something about the desperation of the situation, about the pride he still carried deep inside from his former life, made him nod instead. "Yes? I looking." Jason snorted, but it wasn't an unkind sound, more like the laugh of a man who had reached the end of his rope. "Got any ideas? Because frankly, I'm out of them." It was a joke. Miguel knew it was a joke, but it was also an opening. "Maybe," he said quietly. "I think maybe I see problem." Jason's eyebrows shot up. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing as he studied Miguel with new eyes. "You know something about engines?" Miguel nodded. "In my country, yes, many years." "What country is that again?" "Venezuela. I have shopped there. Fix many cars." Jason's expression changed, skepticism mixed with the faintest glimmer of hope. "You were a mechanic. Why didn't you ever say anything?" Miguel shrugged. Nobody asked. By this time, the others had noticed the conversation and drifted back from the break room. Ray, Pete, and Joe stood a few feet away, curious. "What's going on?" Ray asked. Jason gestured toward Miguel with his half-eaten sandwich. "Apparently, our janitor used to be a mechanic. Says he might know what's wrong with the car." All eyes turned to Miguel. He felt his face grow warm. It had been so long since he'd been the center of attention in a garage. So long since anyone had looked at him with anything but indifference. "Is that true?" Ray asked, his tone neutral, neither believing nor dismissing. Miguel nodded. "I had shop in Caracas, 23 years." "What kind of cars did you work on?" Pete asked, his arms crossed but his expression interested. "All kinds, American, European, many like this." He gestured to the blue sports car. The men exchanged glances. Miguel could read their thoughts as clearly as if they'd spoken them aloud. Was this for real? Could the janitor actually know something they didn't? It seemed impossible, yet they had exhausted all other options. Jason finished his sandwich, crumpled the wrapper, and tossed it into a nearby trash can. "All right," he said, a challenge in his voice. "You think you know what's wrong with this car?" Miguel nodded. "Then what is?" "It? Fuel pressure regulator," Miguel said. Is installed wrong angle, creates vapor lock sometimes, not always. When engine hot and idle in traffic, most likely. There was a moment of silence as the mechanics processed this. We checked the fuel. Pressure, Jason said. But his voice had lost some of its certainty. Pressure is good, Miguel agreed. But regulator is modified part, not original. Is installed wrong. Look. He moved to the engine bay and pointed. Should be straight with fuel rail. This one is at angle. Creates small air pockets sometimes. The mechanics crowded around to see where he was pointing. Pete let out a low whistle. I'll be damned. He might be right. I hadn't even noticed it. Was an aftermarket part, Joe admitted. Jason was silent, staring at the part Miguel had identified. His face went through a series of emotions. Doubt, consideration, and finally, a reluctant kind of respect. So if you're right, Jason said slowly, how do we fix it? Miguel straightened up, and for the first time in years he felt like a mechanic again. Is simple. We adjust angle, reinstall correct way. Maybe 15 minutes work. Ray looked between Miguel and the car, clearly weighing the risk. On one hand, they'd tried everything else. On the other hand, this was their most important customer's prized possession. Look, Jason said, finally breaking the tension. We've got nothing to lose at this point. He turned to Miguel with a half smile, half grimace. Tell you what, if you fix this car, lunch is on me for a month. The others laughed, a release of the stress that had been building for 2 weeks. Deal, Miguel said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Ray hesitated only a moment longer before nodding. All right, Miguel, show us what you've got. And just like that, Miguel the invisible janitor became Miguel the mechanic once more. He set aside his cleaning supplies and approached the car with purpose, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. But it was a good weight, one he had carried proudly for most of his life. I need 14mm wrench, he said. And gasket sealer. Jason handed him the tools without hesitation. The others gathered around, watching with a mixture of curiosity and hope as Miguel prepared to save their reputation, their business relationships, and perhaps something more valuable still, his own dignity. The garage fell silent as Miguel began to work. The usual sounds, the hiss of air tools, the clang of metal, the constant radio chatter, all faded away. Even customers waiting in the front lobby seemed to sense something unusual was happening and spoke in hushed tones. Miguel moved with a quiet confidence that transformed him. Gone was the hesitant janitor who kept to the shadows. In his place stood a craftsman, his hands steady and sure as they moved over the engine. Despite his blue maintenance uniform, he suddenly looked like he belonged there, hunched over the engine bay more than anyone else in the room. Can you hand me that socket wrench? He asked Jason, who complied without a word. Miguel worked methodically, first disconnecting the fuel line and placing a shop towel underneath to catch any drips. His movements were efficient, with no wasted motion. He'd done this hundreds of times before, and his body remembered even if years had passed. The fuel pressure regulator, he explained as he worked, is special part on this model, very sensitive to installation angle. The other mechanics gathered around, watching with growing interest. Pete leaned in closer. So you're saying it's creating an air pocket, he asked. Miguel nodded. Yes, only sometimes when conditions are right, hot day, car sitting in traffic, engine hot, air bubble forms here. He pointed to a specific spot in the fuel line. Bubble blocks fuel flow for split second. Engine stalls. But why wouldn't it show up on diagnostics? Jason asked, his tone, less challenging now, more curious. Because it's not electrical problem. Computer sees fuel pressure normal because it is normal. Until bubble forms. Bubble comes, bubble goes. No sensor to detect. Joe scratched his head. I've been working on cars for 30 years and never heard of this. Is common problem in my country? Miguel replied, carefully removing the regulator. We see often because we have very hot climate and older fuel systems. Many cars modified with parts not exact match for model. He held up the regulator and pointed to a tiny marking on the side that none of them had noticed. See? This part is for different model. Similar, but not same. Someone install before thinking is close enough. The mechanics leaned in to see the marking. Jason let out a low whistle. I never would have caught that, he admitted. Miguel continued working, cleaning the mounting surface and preparing to reinstall the regulator at the correct angle. His fingers, which usually wrapped around mop handles and trash bags, now manipulated delicate car parts with expert precision. In Venezuela, he said as he worked, we learn to fix with what we have. Not always right parts available. Have to understand how systems work together. Ray, who had been watching from a few steps back, moved closer. How long did you say you had your own shop? 23 years, Miguel replied, carefully applying sealant to the mounting surface. Started as helper when I was 14. Opened my own place at 25. What happened? Pete asked, then looked embarrassed as if he realized the question might be too personal. Miguel's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their work. Politics. Economy bad. My neighborhood became dangerous. My son came to America first. Then sent for us, my wife, my daughter, me, better life here, even if he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Even if it meant starting over. Even if it meant losing everything he'd built. The men absorbed this in silence, a new understanding passing between them. For years, they had seen Miguel every day without seeing him at all. Now, looking at his skilled hands working on the complex engine, they were seeing him for the first time. Almost done, Miguel said, tightening the bolts in a careful sequence. Need to make sure angle is perfect. He took his time, adjusting the regulator's position slightly, checking it against the fuel rail, then making another tiny adjustment. Jason handed him tools without being asked, anticipating what Miguel needed next. It was the same way he worked, with Pete on difficult jobs, a dance of collaboration that happened naturally between experienced mechanics. There, Miguel said finally, reconnecting the fuel line and tightening the fitting. Is correct now. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a shop rag. The moment of truth had arrived. The men exchanged glances, no one wanting to be the one to suggest starting the car, as if breaking the spell would somehow change the outcome. Finally, Ray nodded to Jason. Let's see if it works. Jason slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine fired immediately, settling into a smooth idle. The mechanics watched, waited. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The engine purred without a hint of hesitation. Rev it, Pete suggested. Jason pressed the gas pedal. The engine responded instantly, the RPMs climbing smoothly before settling back to idle when he released. Let it run for a while, Miguel said. Get hot, then we know for sure. They stood around the car, waiting. Miguel explained more about the problem, drawing diagrams with his finger on a clean shop rag to show exactly how the vapor lock formed and why it only happened under certain conditions. After 15 minutes, Jason tried something else. He put the car in gear and pressed the brake, creating the exact conditions of idling in traffic on a hot day. Still, the engine ran perfectly. I think you fixed it, Miguel, Ray said finally, a note of awe in his voice. The tension that had gripped the garage for 2 weeks suddenly lifted. Pete slapped Miguel on the back. Joe shook his hand. Jason just stared at the engine, shaking his head in disbelief. 15 minutes, he said. You fixed it in 15 minutes what we couldn't figure out in 2 weeks? Miguel shrugged. Was simple. Problem. Just had to know where to look. Ray pulled out his phone. I'm calling Mr. Winters. He stepped away to make the call, leaving the others still gathered around the car. Where did you learn about European sports cars? Pete asked. I thought you said you had a shop in Venezuela. They don't have many of these there, do they? Miguel smiled slightly. Not many, no. But in my neighborhood, very rich people live up on hill. They bring these cars from Europe, from America. When cars break, dealers want too much money, take too long to fix. So they come to my shop instead. And you could fix them? Jason asked. Most times, yes. I study, read everything I can find, order manuals from other countries, learn by doing. Miguel glanced at Jason. Everyone must learn sometime. Even you were beginner once, yes? Jason laughed. Yeah, though I try to forget those days. He extended his hand to Miguel. I owe you lunch for a month, and maybe a few lessons too. Miguel took his hand, and in that handshake was a recognition that had been denied him for 7 long years. He was a mechanic again, a man of skill and knowledge, not just someone who cleaned up after others. Ray returned, his face bright with relief. Mr. Winters is thrilled. He's coming to pick up the car in an hour. He turned to Miguel. He wants to meet the mechanic who fixed his car when no one else could. Miguel looked down at his janitor's uniform, suddenly aware of the contrast between his current position and his past life. I should clean up first, he said. Damn right. You should, Ray agreed. And when you're done, I want to talk to you in my office. He paused, then added with a smile, about a change in job description. The other mechanics drifted back to their regular work, the blue sports car no longer the center of attention now that its mystery was solved. Miguel stood alone by the vehicle for a moment, running his hand lightly over the fender. It felt good to be seen again, to be valued for the knowledge he carried inside him, to be more than just the man with the mop. He had forgotten how good it felt to fix something broken, not just a car, but maybe his own life too. 3 months had passed since the day Miguel fixed the blue sports car. Spring had turned to summer, and the hot weather had brought a steady stream of air conditioning repairs to Premium Auto Works. But the biggest changes weren't in the season or the workload. They were in the garage itself. Miguel no longer pushed a mop or took out trash. Instead, he wore the same gray work shirt as the other mechanics, with Premium Auto Works embroidered on one side and his name on the other. Not maintenance staff, just Miguel in the same lettering as everyone else's name tags. The conversation with Ray in his office that day had been brief but life-changing. Ray had offered him a position as a diagnostics specialist, focusing on the difficult cases that stumped the other mechanics. The salary was more than triple what he'd been making as a janitor. I don't have license, Miguel had pointed out. No certification in this country. We'll work on that, Ray had promised. You can study for the tests. Jason will help you with the English parts. Meanwhile, you can work under the shop's license. I'll handle the paperwork. And so he had. For the first time in 7 years, Miguel came home with clean hands and grease-stained clothes. He'd called his son that night, his voice cracking with emotion as he shared the news. His wife had cried happy tears, then immediately started planning how they would use the extra money. Maybe they could finally visit his daughter in Florida. Maybe they could move to a better apartment. Now, on a busy Thursday afternoon, Miguel stood in Bay 4, listening carefully to the uneven idle of a pickup truck that had other mechanics scratching their heads. Sounds like it could be an intake manifold leak, Jason suggested, standing beside him. Miguel shook his head. Vacuum leak, yes, but not manifold. Is smaller, maybe PCV valve or vacuum hose to brake booster. In the 3 months they'd worked together, Jason had developed a genuine respect for Miguel's diagnostic skills. The younger mechanic had stopped seeing Miguel as competition and started seeing him as a mentor. I'll check the PCV system first. Jason nodded, reaching for a smoke tester. Want me to show you what I find? Yes, but first I finish with Mr. Winters' car. The blue sports car was back, not for repairs but for routine maintenance. Mr. Winters had insisted that only Miguel work on his vehicles now. In fact, he'd bought 2 more luxury cars since then, and he brought them all to Premium Auto Works. More importantly, he'd told his friends, other business owners, executives, and professionals with expensive cars and the money to maintain them properly. Business had increased by nearly 40% in just 3 months, with most new customers specifically asking for the guy who fixed Thomas Winters' impossible problem. Miguel moved to Bay 1, where the now familiar blue sports car sat. He checked the oil, inspected the filters, and tested the battery with the focused attention he gave every vehicle. To Miguel, there were no unimportant cars, just as there were no unimportant people. Perhaps his years of being invisible had taught him that. As he worked, he noticed a young man in a uniform from the newly opened auto parts store across the street, talking with Ray near the front counter. Ray waved Miguel over. Miguel, this is Carlos. He's new in town, just moved here from Guatemala. His English isn't great yet, but he's looking for work. Says he was a mechanic back home. Thought you might talk to him, see if he knows his stuff. Miguel wiped his hands and extended one to the nervous-looking young man. Hola, Carlos. ¿Cómo estás? The relief on Carlos's face was immediate. For the next 15 minutes, Miguel spoke with him in Spanish, asking about his experience, what kinds of cars he'd worked on, what tools he was familiar with. By the end, Miguel was nodding. He knows cars, Miguel told Ray. Good basic knowledge. Quick learner, I think. Ray considered this. We don't really need another mechanic right now, but we could use someone to clean up around here. The place has been a mess since you changed jobs. Miguel translated this to Carlos, adding his own comment. It is a foot in the door, a beginning, like I had. Carlos nodded eagerly. Si, I can do this. I will work hard. Tell him he starts Monday, Ray said with a small smile, and tell him that if he's half as good as you were, he'll be fixing cars before he knows it. After Carlos left, practically walking on air with excitement, Miguel returned to Mr. Winter's car. As he was finishing up, the shop door opened and Mr. Winters himself walked in. He was a tall man in his 60s, always dressed in expensive suits and polished shoes that seemed out of place in an auto shop. Today, he had another man with him, equally well-dressed. Miguel, Mr. Winters called out with genuine warmth. Just the man I wanted to see. This is my friend Richard. He's having trouble with his Jaguar that 3 other shops couldn't fix. I told him you're the only one who can solve it. Miguel wiped his hands again and shook with both men. Despite his growing confidence in his work role, he still felt slightly awkward in social situations with wealthy clients. But Mr. Winters had a way of putting him at ease. The car is outside, Richard said. Some kind of electronic gremlin. The navigation system crashes and sometimes the whole dashboard goes dark while I'm driving. Miguel nodded. We will look. When can you leave it? Right now, if possible. Thomas insisted I bring it straight to you. As they discussed the details, Miguel caught sight of himself in the reflection of a chrome cabinet. 3 months ago, he would have been invisible to men like Thomas and Richard. They would have discussed their expensive cars with Ray or Jason while he emptied trash cans in the background. Now they sought him out specifically, valued his opinion, trusted his expertise. Later that afternoon, as the shop was closing, Pete approached Miguel with a folder in his hand. Been meaning to give you this, the older mechanic said. It's the study materials for the ASE certification tests. I used them when I got certified. Thought they might help you. Miguel took the folder, touched by the gesture. Thank you, I study every night. You'll pass easy, Pete assured him. You know more than most of the certified guys I've worked with. As Miguel gathered his tools at the end of the day, he looked around the garage that had been his workplace for 7 years but had only become his home in the last 3 months. His gaze fell on something hanging on the wall near the customer waiting area. His old mop mounted like a trophy with a small plaque beneath it. He walked over and read the plaque again, even though he knew the words by heart. Never judge, a book by its cover, or a mechanic by his mop. Miguel's first tool at Premium Auto Works. It had been Ray's idea, a reminder to everyone who worked there about the mistake they'd almost made in overlooking Miguel's talents. For customers, it was just a quirky decoration, but for the staff, it was a daily lesson in humility and respect. Miguel touched the handle of the mop briefly, a silent acknowledgement of how far he'd come and how far he still wanted to go. Tomorrow, he would help Carlos adjust to his new role. Next week, he would start a formal study group with Jason to prepare for his certification tests. And next month, if all went well, he and his wife would visit their daughter in Florida, their first family trip since coming to America. As he walked to his car, no longer the oldest vehicle in the employee parking area, Miguel thought about all the twists and turns his life had taken. The shop he'd lost, the country he'd left, the years of invisibility, and now this unexpected second chance. Perhaps that was the true lesson of the mop on the wall. Life was full of unexpected turns, but with patience, dignity, and an unwavering belief in your own worth, even the longest detours could lead you back to where you belonged.